Good afternoon. It's a great honor to be here. For the first time in about 15 years, I've actually written a specific paper, and if you don't mind, I will read the paper. I put a lot of thought into this. Was that funny? No. No, it'll still be interesting, promise. No, it's going to be good. I do have some slides, so, but I'm wasting time now with this, so. All right. I'm deeply honored to present on the lessons learned from the evolution of vocational psychology at this wonderful SVP conference. Having been involved in this organization since its inception has been one of the most meaningful aspects of my life. I would also like to thank the Florida State University team for hosting this conference and for all the inspirational work that they have done over the past few decades in advancing the creative synthesis of theory, research, and practice. In this presentation, I'm hoping to provide a circumscribed perspective on the lessons learned from the evolution of our field. As you can imagine, it will be impossible to capture the depth and breadth of the history of our field in such a brief presentation. Rather, I will use my time here to infuse my own personal perspective on the need for inclusiveness, justice, and a broad macro-level view of our discipline as the optimal lens with which to examine the history of our field. For those of you interested in a deeper, more detailed analysis, I would refer you to two particular chapters. One is the one by Mark Savickas and David Baker from the 2005 Handbook of Vocational Psychology, and the second is an excellent new chapter by Mark Pope in the 2015 APA Handbook of Career Intervention. They're both seminal pieces. So rather than summarize the existing contributions of Pope and Savickas and Baker, I will attempt to carve out my own niche in presenting the lessons learned from the evolution of our field. The goals of this presentation are to identify the complex nexus of relationships among theory, research, and practice that has characterized our field for over a century. To deepen our knowledge of these relationships, I propose that we expand the scope with which we view this history to encompass macro-level forces that have shaped our field. In keeping with my deep concern for inclusiveness and social justice, I will enrich this historical analysis by infusing a view of economic and social forces which I believe have played a major role in the growth of our field. I will also argue that explicit attention to ways in which economic and social forces shape our social constructions of knowledge that will help to advance our thinking about theory, research, and practice. I believe this sort of macro-level and critical analysis of historical trends is particularly needed at this juncture, given that we are observing such significant growth in precarious work and increasing instability in the workplace. So the assumptions that are going to guide my presentation are, one, that I believe that historical analyses are social constructions and therefore would benefit from employing a social constructionist lens. I joked in a previous presentation that I only took one economics course. I was actually a history major for a year, so I have a little credibility. Like psychology and other social sciences, historical analyses reflect the influence of culture and relationships which shape how we view the world and how we make meaning of our observations. My concerns about expanding the range and impact of vocational psychology continue to shape my social constructions. As indicated at the outset, my thinking is framed by my investment in developing theories, practices, and research that will embrace all of those who work and who would like to work. Following the advice of Malcolm McLaren, an award-winning community psychologist, I am adopting a macro-psychological perspective in this presentation. According to McLaughlin, it's a great article he wrote in 2014 in the American Psychologist, a macro-psychological framework would ask the following sorts of questions. What sort of social systems are likely to promote a sense of worth, inclusion, and participation, and how can such social systems be created and maintained? Following these assumptions, I also believe that economic affordance and constraints have influenced individuals, and as I will argue here, they've also influenced our professional direction with respect to theory, research, and practice. As reflected in existing histories of our field, vocational psychology was profoundly shaped by the rise of automation in the workplace, which created vastly diverse array of jobs, many of which required more complex levels of education and training. The growth of jobs in manufacturing and industry had a substantive spillover into auxiliary fields, including education, healthcare, the public sector, and related fields of commerce and transportation. This boom in the sheer numbers of occupations that existed gave rise to the growing need for people to make informed decisions about their education, training, and the course of their work lives. An underlying issue in the growth of the field was the vast expansion of volition for working people. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the array of options that people had in relation to their work lives was quite limited, except for people with a fair degree of privilege. However, the expansion of the labor market that arose out of the Industrial Revolution soon led to increasing levels of volition throughout Western nations. To guide these growing numbers of decisions, the fields of vocational psychology and applied psychology evolved, generating research, theories, and practice. Building on the Civicus and Baker and Pope contributions, I am proposing that we need to expand our view of historical forces to encompass overt and covert economic forces that play a major role in shaping our profession, particularly in relation to access to work and access to career choice privilege. In addition to the obvious social and historical forces that shape the theory, research, and practice nexus of our field, what I'm going to propose is that more covert influences have been at play, and that these influences and these forces affected our view of target populations and our view of work-based challenges and assets. The economic forces that led to the growth in volition, which then facilitated the development of our profession, regrettably did not reach all sectors of the population equally. Women, people of color, people with disabling conditions, and others on the margins were not always the recipients of career choice privilege. At the outset of the development of our field, theories, research, and practices were focused on people who were beginning to experience a growing array of options. To respond to this need, Frank Parsons and many of his contemporaries developed models of vocational guidance that were focused on both survival and self-determination. In the first half of the 20th century, there was a great deal of flux in the economy, and the prevailing theories reflected this. Indeed, the focus on survival, which was evident in some of the early PE fit models, often assumed that poor and working class students and clients were not going to have as much of an opportunity for self-determination. That said, they did have some choices in their selection of work pathways that would enhance their capacity to survive, and for some to create lives that were reasonably satisfying. During this period, the nascent field of vocational guidance provided resources for individuals whose options varied considerably, encompassing people on unemployment to students from the most privileged secondary schools and colleges in the nation. The level of theory, research, and practice, however, was starting to tilt toward those at somewhat the higher end of the economic spectrum. Rather than view the massive changes that took place during World War II, which have been which have been well documented in these historical pieces in our field, I would like to describe a subtle shift that took place after the war, which I argue transformed the discourse of this field dramatically, and I'm afraid did it in a way that was unwitting and not knowing. As we know from our history, many nations in the West, especially those whose infrastructures were not dramatically affected by the war, went through huge economic booms during the post-World War II era. The average unemployment rate in the United States during the 1950s was in the 4.5% range. However, and this is critical, the economy grew by 37% in that decade. It was often known as the decade of prosperity. Similar economic booms were occurring in other nations, particularly those that were victorious in the war but did not experience the war firsthand, like Canada and Australia. This post-World War II era was characterized by the growing middle class, upward mobility, increasing access to higher education, and the growth of professions, many of which were developing hierarchical career paths. My thesis in this presentation is that this period strongly shaped the discourse in our field about theory, research, and practice. During the 1950s and 1960s, our most important theoretical advances were made, including the seminal work by Donald Super, John Holland, Ann Rowe, and David Tiedemann, among others. In my view, this economic boom shaped the nature of theory, research, and practice, creating the impression that we were on our way to the great big beautiful tomorrow, which was a song from the GE exhibit at the World's Fair in Queens, New York. I grew up in Queens. I went to the World's Fair 10 times each summer by bus. My parents let us go. I was 10, my brother was 12. It was not the helicopter parent era. But we went to the World's Fair, and I will say that it dramatically transformed my thinking, and I could do a whole nother talk on it. But in my view, the most salient working people that these theorists saw during the 50s and 60s were those waiting on the Metro North train stations in Westchester County, north of New York City, near the homes of Roger Myers and Jean-Pierre Jourdain, two of my professors at Teachers College, or those driving across the George Washington Bridge, accompanying a young Donald Super from New Jersey to Teachers College, seeing all these rising middle-class workers who were now dressed for success and ready to move up. Of course, not everybody was moving up in the 1960s and 1950s. We still had large pockets of poverty and working people who did not have the skills or social capital to take advantage of the boom economy. In this context, I will underscore here what I've said in many public presentations. I do not believe that Super, Holland, Tiedemann, or other brilliant theorists, including my colleagues at Florida State, I don't think anybody sat in a conference room and explicitly considered the development of theories and practices that would further marginalize those who were left out of the boom. Rather, and this is critical, I believe that they were profoundly and often unwittingly influenced by the broader macro-level forces that created the feel that the current reality was in fact true for all or most, and the current perceived reality would continue unabated into the future. So what happened after our former enemies and allies built up after the war? Well, we then had intense competition in the global marketplace, and we began to experience profound ruptures in the economy. By the early 1970s, the United States was starting to have unemployment rates that reached well into 11 and 12% ranges, with stubborn recessions and inflation that cut into the wealth of people across the spectrum. The economic trends since the era of prosperity have been very different than the golden post-World War II period, a point that was made very eloquently in Pope's chapter. However, the discourse that we have developed as a field, reifying choice, dreams, purpose, self-concept implementation, and well-being have remained steady guiding posts of our practice, and to a lesser extent of our theories and research. What has happened to the focus on helping people manage short-term work-based challenges such as layoffs and downsizing? Where is that literature coming from? How well are our theories and research informing practice in the 21st century? I propose that the seeds of a broader and more inclusive vision for career development have always been evident, but have often been on the margins of our discourse. Even back in the 1970s, maybe some of you will remember this, there were two articles that I read with great interest in the Personnel and Guidance Journal. One was by Charles Warnath, another Teachers College graduate, was entitled Career Theories, Direction to Nowhere, came out in 1975. Another was written by Steve Baumgartner in 1977, entitled Vocational Planning, The Great Swindle. Both of these articles openly question the prevailing focus on choice and privilege, seemingly influenced by the major economic transformations of the early 1970s, when the boom economy ended, leaving many people struggling for survival. In addition, our feminist colleagues bravely took on the major theories by critiquing the white male and middle-class assumptions of Holland's theory and of Super's lifespan, life-space theory. Furthermore, scholars from the world of multicultural counseling and race and culture levied profound impacts of the prevailing discourse, led by two seminal chapters that certainly influenced me. The one by Edmund Gordon in Edward Herr's 1974 book. How many of you remember that one? You don't remember? That was a great chapter. And then Elsie Smith wrote a brilliant chapter on race in the 1983 Handbook of Vocational Psychology. Soon other scholars on race and culture, such as Janet Helms, Fred Leong, Naja Fuad, who's right here, added to these critiques, helped to unpack the cultural hegemony of Western and white belief systems in the world of theory, research, and practice. Since the early 1990s, the assumptions and tenets that have been guiding the theory, research, and practice in our field began to feel the impact of more inclusive theories. In 1993, Mary Sue Richardson, are you here still, Mary Sue? No. Wrote a groundbreaking article in the Journal of Counseling and Psychology on the role of work in people's lives. This article created a clarion call for a more intellectually diverse perspective in our field, raising questions about the prevailing notions of career choice privilege that had been evident since the post-World War II years. Another critical movement in the early 1990s was the publication of the monograph on social cognitive career theory by Lent, Brown, and Hackett. Steve, you want to make sure Bob knows I gave him a shout out here. This theory, which gained popularity early in our field by identifying the way sexism functions to curtail options for women, brought contextual factors to the forefront. In addition, SCCT generated much-needed research on the ways in which people who had been on the margins of our field managed the complex tasks of moving from a focus on survival to a focus on self-determination. Once we moved into the 21st century, a more concerted critique emerged in the discourse of our field. My colleagues and I explicitly sought out the perspectives from liberation psychology to clearly critique the existing set of assumptions that still guided our research theory and practices. While many new efforts have been taking place in academic circles and intellectual debates, a review of practice-based journals and blogs, as well as career counseling conferences, reveals that the prevailing ethos is still one of helping people to choose long-term hierarchical careers that they will have for many years. At this point, I believe that there is a disjuncture between theoretical efforts, current research trends, and work-based counseling practices. While many important critiques have been levied in our discourse, the predominant practice modalities are still formulated based on the implicit assumption of preparing people for the great, big, beautiful tomorrow. For example, there is little linkage between the theories we have espoused to guide career practice and the needs of practitioners working in one-stop career centers who are left to rely on common sense, or sometimes they can get short-term training from NCDA. I argue that this state of affairs exists because many of our newer theoretical formulations and research findings have not been well integrated into the practice community. Obviously, I forgot to put this slide on when it belonged to be here, but this was the margins of our discourse. I'm almost done. It is common knowledge in our field that we are moving into an era of precarious work, one that is resulting in the growth of contract work and less stable employment. I believe that the implications of this shift require radical changes in how we conceptualize the relationship among theory, research, and practice. A few major points emerge in my thinking. One is we need to think outside the box with respect to relevant theory. It is true that we are not economists and sociologists. However, if we do not read these bodies of work, we will be left in an intellectual vacuum without the perspectives needed to design effective interventions for client populations. We need to develop theories that embrace economic factors and sociological influences. As an exemplar, I will provide an unabashed promotion of the new psychology of working theory, authored by my former students Ryan Duffy, Matt Deemer, myself, and one of Ryan's current students, Kelsey Otten. This theory is designed to be an exemplar of the sort of intellectual endeavor that embraces the world we live in now, a world where work is not stable and where access to work is profoundly shaped by macro-level forces and individual psychological attributes. In closing, I would like to underscore the importance of not simply identifying the impact of macro-level forces in the development of our field. I hope that you will come away from this presentation by considering how these macro-level influences actually shaped our constructions, and they continue to shape our constructions of what is real and what is important. While I have sounded some concerns about how we develop and sustain discourses in vocational psychology, I am optimistic about the future of the field. I believe that the foundations we have established have served us well and will continue to serve us well. However, and this is important, it is now time to integrate the critiques of the post-World War II ethos that have continued to dominate much of our practice and develop clear linkages between theory, research, and practice. Leading this effort would be theory-driven and evidence-based interventions that will help clients navigate the precarious work world that is increasingly dominating the labor market. For example, we need to develop coherent theory-building bridges between the quick and highly focused job search strategies that are used by one-stop career centers and the long-term career planning that is the standard in 21st century career counseling for people with a relative degree of volition. Similarly, we should not create walls, and I mean that as a political thing here, we should not create walls, but we need to create bridges among the major theories, practices, and research paradigms, and let me be very clear about this. To quote a major presidential candidate, I'm not saying I support her or not, but I'm quoting her, "There is more that unites us in this room than divides us. We are linked by our hope to improve the lives of people and the well-being of communities. Let's return to the mission of our first SVP conference and create integrative research and practice communities that will try to address the massive problems that people face at work. I would now like to close by thanking my host for putting together this conference. I'm very honored to have been asked to share my comments at the closing. It was a tremendous privilege for me. And I'd like to thank each of you for waiting around, attending this session. And I look forward to your future collaborations and creativity and your contributions in creating a more inclusive and just vocational psychology. Thank you very much.